The woman gripped her phone tightly as she spoke sternly to the police. "I'm telling you, there's a black kid causing trouble in my yard." Soon, flashing lights lit up the quiet street, and the sound of sirens pierced the calm afternoon. In the middle of it all stood Ethan Carter, a 12-year-old boy standing beside a police car. His face was pale, and his hands trembled. Around him, a small crowd had gathered, their whispers filling the air. This was how it all began. Ethan, a bright and polite boy who had just moved into the neighborhood with his mom, loved basketball. He could often be found outside dribbling and practicing his shots. That's exactly what he was doing when it happened. The basketball bounced out of his driveway and rolled across the street. Laughing, Ethan followed it as it came to a stop in a neighbor's yard. It didn't seem like a big deal, or at least that's what he thought. Walking to the edge of the yard, he called out, "Hello? Excuse me, my ball's here." But no one answered. Ethan hesitated. He didn't want to cause any trouble, so he looked around to see if anyone was watching. When no one came out, he stepped into the yard to grab his ball. What Ethan didn't know was that someone was watching. Karen Thompson stood at her window, her eyes fixed on him. To her, it wasn't just a boy retrieving a ball, it was something else entirely. Karen frowned, her mind racing with assumptions. Who is this kid, she thought. Why is he in my yard? Without waiting to find out, she picked up her phone and dialed. "Hello, police?" "There's a black kid causing trouble in my yard," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "He looks suspicious. Can you send someone right away?" By the time Ethan picked up his ball and started walking back, he heard something that made him freeze, sirens, loud and close. He turned and saw a patrol car pulling up. 2 officers stepped out, their faces serious. For a moment, Ethan didn't understand what was happening. Why are they here? The officers approached him, their voices calm but firm. "What are you doing here, son?" one of them asked. Ethan clutched his basketball tighter. I just came to get my ball," he said softly. Before he could explain further, Karen stepped outside, pointing at him. Her voice was louder now. "That's him. He's been snooping around here all day. I don't care what he says. That boy doesn't belong in this neighborhood." The officers exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. One of them turned back to Ethan. "Son," he said calmly, "is that true? Were you trespassing?" Ethan looked down at his basketball, his voice barely audible. Barely a whisper, Ethan said, "I wasn't trespassing. I was just getting my ball. It rolled into her yard." Karen folded her arms tightly, her voice sharp and cutting. "Oh, sure," she snapped. "That's what they always say. It starts with a ball, and before you know it, they're scoping out houses, looking for something to steal." The weight of her words hit Ethan hard. His eyes darted nervously from the officers to the crowd, and back to Karen. His chest tightened. He opened his mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come out. He felt the eyes of the officers on him, the eyes of neighbors peeking through windows and watching from porches. "Why didn't you stay in your own yard?" one of the officers asked. Ethan blinked, confused by the question. He felt the weight of every gaze on him, waiting for him to say the wrong thing. Karen folded her arms again, her face smug. "I told you," she said to the officers. "I knew he was up to something." But Ethan wasn't up to anything. He was just a boy with a basketball, and now he was being treated like a criminal. The officers, unsure of what to do but pressured by Karen's insistence, made a choice. One of them told Ethan he would need to come with them for questioning. Ethan didn't resist. He didn't argue. But his voice shook as he asked for one thing. "Can I call my mom?" What Karen didn't know, what the officers didn't know, was that Ethan's mother wasn't just any parent. She was Governor Lisa Carter, the most powerful woman in the state. The phone rang in her office. When she picked up, Ethan's trembling voice told her everything. Everything she needed to know. She didn't hesitate. She made one call, then another, and within minutes, her convoy was speeding toward the neighborhood. The sirens began. Not one, not two, a whole fleet of black SUVs barreled down the street, lights flashing, engines roaring. Karen turned to look, her face twisting in confusion. She had no idea what was coming, but she was about to find out. As the convoy rolled to a stop, the doors swung open, and out stepped Governor Lisa Carter. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. Her presence alone demanded attention. Everyone knew who she was, but imagine Karen's shock. She thought she was dealing with a simple case of trespassing. How could she have known that the boy she accused was the son of the state's most powerful woman? Lisa's gaze swept over everyone, the officers, the neighbors, Karen, and finally stopped on Ethan. She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then at last she spoke. Her voice was calm but carried an edge that cut through the tension like a knife. "What's happening here?" The officers hesitated. One of them cleared his throat nervously, glancing at Karen. "Governor Carter," he began respectfully, "we were called here for a report of suspicious activity. This young man was seen on private property." Lisa raised an eyebrow, her attention shifting to Karen. "And you made this report?" Karen, still struggling to regain her composure, nodded quickly. "Yes," she said, her voice quieter than before. I saw him in my yard. I didn't know who he was or what he was doing, so I called the police. I thought it was the right thing to do." Lisa didn't respond immediately. She let the silence hang in the air, her eyes never leaving Karen. The weight of her unspoken words was palpable. Finally, she turned back to the officers. "This is Ethan Carter," she said, her voice steady. "My son. What evidence do you have to suggest he was doing anything suspicious?" The officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable. Lisa's gaze softened slightly as she looked at Ethan. She gave him a small, reassuring nod before turning her attention back to Karen. "So," she said slowly, her words deliberate, "a 12-year-old boy retrieves a basketball and your first instinct is to call the police?" Karen sputtered, her hands tightening into fists. "I didn't know who he was," she said defensively. "He could have been anyone. And kids like him, they don't just wander into yards without a reason." The crowd stirred at her words, whispers growing louder. Lisa's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing. "Kids like him?" she repeated, her tone dangerously calm. "Let me make something clear. My son is a bright, kind, and respectful young man. He had every right to retrieve his ball, and your assumptions, your bias, put him in harm's way today." Karen opened her mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it, her face reddening as she shrank under Lisa's gaze. Lisa turned to the officers. "I trust there will be no further action against my son?" The lead officer straightened, his tone contrite. "No, ma'am. There's no evidence of any wrongdoing here." "Good," Lisa said firmly. She looked back at Karen, her voice quiet but resolute. "Think carefully before you act next time. The world is watching." With that, Lisa placed a protective hand on Ethan's shoulder and guided him toward the convoy. The crowd parted, murmurs following in their wake. Karen stood frozen, her face pale and her fists trembling. She had wanted to make a point, but instead she had made a scene she would never forget. Lisa's expression remained unchanged, but her voice dropped lower, sharper. "Kids like him?" she repeated. "What exactly does that mean?" The tension in the air thickened. Neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of Lisa's words sinking in. Karen stammered, her earlier confidence now completely gone. I didn't mean—" Lisa stepped closer, her voice calm but commanding. "Let me be very clear," she said. "You called the police on a child. You accused him without evidence. And now, you stand here trying to justify it with assumptions that say far more about you than they do about him." She paused, her words deliberate. "You should be ashamed." The crowd stood in stunned silence, the truth of the moment settling heavily over them. Lisa turned to the officers. "I want this resolved," she said firmly. "And I want it done the right way. My son deserves better than this." The officers nodded quickly, their professionalism returning. "Yes, ma'am," one of them said. Karen, her face flushed with shame, managed to stammer, "I'm sorry, Governor Carter." Lisa didn't respond immediately. She looked at Karen, then back at the officers, her voice steady and deliberate. "This isn't just about my son," she said. "This is about every child who's been made to feel like they don't belong. Every parent who's had to wonder if their child will make it home safely." The crowd, now completely silent, hung on her every word. For some, this was a moment of realization, a mirror held up to their own biases. For others, it was a stark reminder of the work that still needed to be done. Then Lisa addressed the crowd. She spoke not as a politician, but as a mother. She talked about fear, about prejudice, and about the importance of seeing one another as human beings first. Her words were simple but powerful. "We all have a responsibility," she said, "to ourselves, to our neighbors, and to the children who will inherit this world. Let's make it one they can be proud of." Her voice carried over the quiet street, resonating deeply with everyone who heard it. The neighbors, the officers, and even Karen stood in silent reflection. Lisa placed a protective arm around Ethan's shoulders and led him toward the convoy. The crowd parted as they passed, whispers trailing behind them. Karen remained rooted in place, her shame etched on her face, as the reality of her actions settled in. This was more than a lesson, it was a reckoning. As the convoy pulled away, the street fell quiet once more, but the echoes of the moment lingered. For the neighbors, for Karen, and for everyone who had witnessed it, this was a day they would not soon forget. Where they feel safe, where they feel valued. Lisa turned back to Karen one last time. Her voice was calm, but her words carried the weight of a promise. "Think carefully before you make assumptions like this again," she said, "because next time, it won't end here." Karen's face fell, her earlier bravado completely gone. For Lisa, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of changing a mindset, a community, and ensuring no other child would have to endure what Ethan just did. The impact was undeniable. Karen Thompson, once so confident in her place in the community, found herself increasingly isolated. The shame of what she had done lingered in every interaction, every glance from her neighbors. Lisa, however, didn't stop there. She reached out to the local community association, proposing a series of workshops and discussions about bias, inclusion, and accountability. Ethan, too, found a way to channel his experience. With his mom's encouragement, he spoke about what had happened to him during a school assembly. "I didn't understand why someone would think I was bad just because of the way I look," he said. "But now I know. We have to stand up to that. We have to be better." What had started as a single incident, a basketball rolling into the wrong yard, became a moment of reckoning for an entire community. Karen Thompson learned a painful lesson about the consequences of her actions, one that would stay with her long after the flashing lights and whispers faded. And Lisa Carter? She continued to fight, not just as a governor, but as a mother, a neighbor, and a voice for those who often went unheard. Because in the end, this wasn't just a story about one boy, one woman, or one neighborhood. It was a story about the power of truth, the courage to confront our assumptions, and the hope that together we can create a world where everyone truly belongs.